No problem.
Okay. Well, hi, welcome to this Reinventing the Wheel series, which is a program of the Knowledge House for Craft, supported by the Garland platform. And I'm speaking to you from Melbourne, otherwise known as Naarm. The traditional owners of my place are the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respect to their elders, past and present, and also to the ancestors of the lands where you come from. Now, this is a series which is designed by the Knowledge House of Craft, and I pay my respects to my colleagues here in Moana, Oceania, Kolakesa and Barbara. Love to see you here. Who've been doing wonderful work in the region. So this is an opportunity to sort of connect up some of the work that's happening in the Atlantic area with some of the thinking in the Pacific, and that's very much appreciated. So just to show you briefly where we house these talks in the vault, the Reinventing the Wheel series. You can see all of them here. So what happens after this is that we distill what are the key learnings of this session and include the video and presentations as well. So we see it as being a spoke in the wheel of knowledge as we sort of reinvent our understanding of what material culture is and the role that it plays in our world. So it's a great pleasure to be here with the Jugaad project. Amila and I have already had a chat on Garland with a podcast, so you can look to that to understand something about her personal journey through this. And Amila has been associated particularly with the University College London and is a material anthropologist. And what she's done is to be able to put together a very interesting and generous platform of
no, we're going to go down over here.
Sorry.
Good girl.
What she's been able to do is put together a very generous open source platform of knowledge, which is about the nature of material anthropology. There are two things that make it particularly important for us at the Knowledge House for Craft. One is the way in which this knowledge is being shared. It's not housed in an ivory tower with peer-reviewed journals that are only available in very expensive subscription journals limited to academics, but it's designed so that the people who often are profiled, which are those in more traditional cultures, are also able to access this knowledge as well, which is very important, which makes it a kind of circular platform. The other is the very intellectual foundation of it, which is about the importance of material culture in how we construct our sense of identity, our feelings through our cultural frameworks. And that's very much present in this book that we'll be hearing about, the efficacy of intimacy and belief in world-making practices, which is a very important step in overcoming the Cartesian divide between mind and body, showing how objects and material culture are intrinsic to our sense of self and our sense of place in the world. So we have the fortune of hearing from the founder of the Jugaad project and editor of this book, Amila, with two of the authors who have contributed very fascinating chapters in this book. We've got Patricia Rodriguez de Souza from Sao Paulo. Boa noche, Patricia, and she had a very interesting article about Brazilian material religion, particularly through the use of dolls. And she's an assistant professor in the postgraduate program of religious studies at Pontifical Catholic University of Sao Paulo. And also Susan Rogers, Professor Emerita and Distinguished Professor, Ethics and Society, College of Holy Cross in the US. And she had a very interesting chapter on the use of textiles in culture, particularly in Indonesia. So we will hear from them and have some time to reflect on what it is that they have to tell us. So if we could begin by taking us on the start of this journey, Mila, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kevin. I'm just going to share my screen here. Here we go. I'm going to keep it short. It's a lot of information. I know that I'm kind of crowding into these 5 slides, but the session is being recorded, and hopefully the slides will also be accessible. I'm happy to send them to be posted online. So first of all, my deep thanks to Kevin Murray, Garland Magazine, the board of trustees and advisors for Knowledge House for Craft, and my co-editors at the Jugaad project, as well as my sheer delight to be able to sit here with Patricia and Susan as my co-travelers for 3 years who trusted me and said yes to the project. Although I'm sure there were times when they wondered why they had done so, and where this was headed. But this was a journey we went on together, and we were very ambitious. And what I failed to tell them was that this was an experiment. It was something completely new that I was trying for the first time. This idea that I care very deeply about embodiment. I care about practices. I'm trained in this. I have the toolkit. But to make this social, are there people who would be willing to go on the roller coaster with me? So I built the roller coaster, but is there somebody who's willing to take the ride with me? And I tried inviting numerous people, and this was a process that took over 3 years. And Susan joined in the very beginning. She was a very early recruit, and I think Patricia came on also pretty early in the process. So I don't want to talk too much about their chapters, but we do have about 11 or 12 chapters in the book, and they're quite diverse in terms of the content, broadly divided between issues of belief in religion, things that we would more easily be able to recognize as religious practices, with a very distinct cosmology or a certain framework in which rituals take place. And also towards the end, this notion of belief as enchantment and disenchantment, the fact that we could not ignore the fact, especially during 2020 to 23, during the pandemic, that the world that we were living in was extremely challenging for us. And it made us very aware, many of us for the first time, that our fit in this world was not as easy or as comfortable as we would like it to be, and that we were dealing with this crisis on a global scale, which brought a number of issues to the surface. So the idea of efficacious intimacy is an anthropological method because it's basically a mode of research, which kind of starts with an entryway into a culture by focusing on what we broadly refer to as material culture studies, and which was something that I was kind of trained in through my background in art and design, but also as an anthropologist at UCL. So that's part of the intellectual lineage, if you want to call it that. And my own doctoral research was about Hinduism. It was about bhakti, which is devotion, devotional love. And within ISKCON, of course, which is a transnational universalizing and missionizing group where devotion has got a very particular kind of flavor. It has to be enacted. You have to do things because you are devotional. You have to do devotion. To feel is to do. And there are certain, of course, very complicated, theological concepts that also come along with it. But I wasn't so much into exegesis. I was looking more at the social lives of the people who were in the context of either embroidering garments for the deities. The deities get new garments every day. They do have a wardrobe. There is, of course, very much this parallel and analogy between worshiping the deity and treating them very much as you would the king or the queen or the host of the of the temple or the space, who's given all that kind of respect and attention and labor. That is something that I was doing in 2013. And that's where I made the fundamental connection between trying to bring in studies from, in a very eclectic way, from the French School of Techniques and Culture, which of course is looks at material religion and has been adapted to material religion in a particular way. So I was bringing in these ideas. I was being exposed to all these ideas in different contexts and trying to figure out how they could possibly work together in a different cultural context. How successful that was, I would leave it up to you if you were ever to read any of those publications dealing with that body of work. But in 2019, after I had just completed my postdoctoral project in museum anthropology, I was very eager to do something with everything that I had in terms of ideas, archives, something that I felt that I had to give and offer the world. And this started almost as a very casual thought of starting the platform of the Jugaad project. Jugaad itself is a very loaded term. It has certain connotations in South Asia. There are parallels to this term as improvisation, as bricolage, as do-it-yourself, and also as simply as everyday hacking things to make certain things happen, to make certain things effective, to make certain things efficacious. And I think ultimately a big part of what we do, and we find people doing, is people doing things because they are effective. And what are the effects of their actions and practices is what I wanted to focus on. So the 3 workshops were held over 3 years, but there was a more curated, targeted call to scholars. And the strength of the volume, and I think the uniqueness of the volume, is that it is interdisciplinary. So while there is a lot of talk about interdisciplinarity, I think that talk has been going on for perhaps decades now. To actually do it, of course, in a certain way, in a very serious way and in a very committed way, where we kind of are allowing ourselves to be challenged and also challenging each other to see how much we can expand and incorporate and borrow from each other. That was part of I think, the process. Another part of the process was always being conscious that, yes, we were exchanging. The word exchange is very neutral. We exchange. But also, how do you exchange? What is the kind of relationships that we are forming with each other? And I hope it has been done in the spirit of camaraderie, and that we have this trust and friendship that was generated that carries us forward even today and in the future in our collaborations with each other. So what is efficacious intimacy? I think very simply, efficacy is the ability to produce some kind of result that you might desire or intend. And we should remember that you might desire something, but what you end up getting might be something quite different. So it's not I'm not implying a mechanistic or a kind of a functional relationship between inefficacy. There's something a lot more complicated going on here. In terms of the physicality, the psychology, and the emotional relationships. And intimacy is a word that we often find being used perhaps in the West in a very particular context. I think in the US, we tend to hear it in popular consumption in the context of perhaps love or physical love. But if you actually look at it, it's just about something that's close or familiar or proximate, which in turn can be expanded if we're talking about space and spatiality. We can make it a dynamic of this play between intimacy, closeness, and distance. Belief was also a very big part of it because my initial research was in religion. It was not too far of a jump to move to belief, but to also find a way to talk about belief that was not only in a religious context, but think about belief as a efficacious state, even in, let's say, the domain of politics. So there were a couple of things I was being very ambitious, and we were being very ambitious in trying to do in putting these chapters together, was to not just talk about belief and efficacy and closeness or intimacy, but also to see how the papers dialogued with each other and how the chapters dialogued with each other across this notion of domains, because we know in disciplines we tend to silo ourselves. Some people study religion Some people study politics, and so on and so forth. So it was a kind of a testing of these ideas. Could these ideas work across politics and religion, and would people find this compelling? The important thing, of course, is to point out that why do we care about practices? We care about practices because in the framework that we are working within, in a material culture framework, the notion of objectification and subjectivation is quite a fundamental idea, and I think quite well known for those who kind of focus on material culture studies. And the kind of the core of it is that to say that we act upon the world, we leave our traces on the world, and in turn, the world, whatever you consider as being part of the world and external to yourself, acts upon you and affects and changes you also. Another thing that I was really concerned about also was this idea that what is the effect? What is the effect of practices? What is created by practices? And was there a case to be made for, in a sociological, not just anthropological, but in a sociological context, for what a lot of sociologists are still very interested in, which is what is the relationship between the individual and society. But this is, again, a place where I am personally quite heavily influenced by my own mentor, Jean-Pierre Wanier's work on socialization and the idea that the subject is a more capacious, a more useful term to use instead of thinking of it as the individual. To make it really simple, there's, of course, this common sense notion. We think we are independent, we are independent, we are individuals, we are self-made, and we are transparent. That means we are transparent to ourselves. We know what we are doing, we know why we are doing it. And this notion of rationality, that we live our lives through rational means, which is, of course, also something that we're contesting here. We do not always know what we are doing. We do not always control and manifest what our intentions may be. And we are certainly not independent. So this idea of motion, being in motion, a world in motion, becomes the device by which we talk about many, many things, as you see here, including maybe more philosophical issues of what is the world that we want to live in. So thank you for bearing with those rather denser slides. What I enjoyed putting together in this slide was, for the very first time, I've always held away my own personal history and anything to do with my own family or my family history, and never really brought it into presentations. And I haven't really written about it. And I'm hoping that Kevin's invitation will be a provocation for me to go back to this and look at this and see what happens. This is not the content of my chapter in the book. The chapter in the book deals with mask making by pandemic mask makers. This is something I realized I would like to do and bring into the context of craft and making. On one level, it fits into a very conventional container of what we may think of as craft, what we may think of as gendered craft. And this is my grandmother. She was a Telugu Catholic. She was 14 years old when she was married. She was educated in a Catholic convent by the nuns. And one of the many things that she learned was crocheting. And the only thing I have of her is this runner, as well as one of her bangles, one of her small bangles that kind of amaze me when I see how small her wrist actually was. So this particular crocheted piece on the left-hand side went through a history of adaptation and almost being saved by my mother, Felicia, who decided that this particular crocheted runner that her mother was giving her in 1966 was way too be good to be used as an attachment for her petticoat. And I think that was a very, very wise decision. And this has made me think about how I want to write about my mother also, and her relationship as herself being a trained artist and very much somebody who I got more of my aesthetic side from. So my mother decided it was too good, in her words, to be used as a petticoat liner or a petticoat attachment. She saved the runner. She attached it to a piece of blue cotton and turned it into a runner that would sit on top of the piano in the house. This is how it made its way into my home. And this is how I got to know it. It was a crocheted runner that sat on top of the piano in the living room. And that's how I got to know it. So now in 2024, I finally wake up to the fact that these objects exist. And I asked my parents, could you show me the crochet samplers that she made? Because that is the only thing we have of her that's left apart from the runner. And in these sampler books that my grandmother collected are very beautifully, very expertly, and very skilled fragments. I call them fragments because they are samples of what a crochet piece could be constructed from. And that sample book was made before 1950. So there's a very long history. There is a story. There's a story to be told about Catholicism. There's a story to be told about Indian Catholicism and how crochet fits into this. And my own grandmother, as a very devout Catholic, who would make me tell the rosary in the evenings. And of course, as a 6-year-old child, I had no idea what I was doing. So this is a kind of a partner to the larger story of the idea of Hinduism, of course, coming from my father's side. And I've always talked about the Hindu influence, but it's interesting now to see that through this craft, we come back to the story of what is kinship, what is inherited, what is care, what is connection. How are gendered people made and created and transmitted through these techniques of crochet? And I think it's a revival and a kind of appreciation that many women of my generation are going through. And I look forward to writing more about this. But I wanted to share this with you because I felt it shared the spirit of why I was doing all these things and was not as analytical and as distant as maybe the first two slides would make you think the project is about. So we have very explicit religious context in the book, obviously. Patricia is going to talk about Umbanda. There are many chapters on Islam, Hinduism, Shinto, Buddhism, things that we identify and have no problem identifying as quote unquote religious practices. But when we talk about spirituality, of course, we go into murkier territory. And I think here is where the question of values comes in, because it's my interest in values that connects these domains, that connects these categories of terms. And I really look forward to delving more into all of these through the device of craft. So finally, what is at stake? That we perceive the value of intimacy and this dialogue between closeness and distance as relational forces. They relate things. How do they relate them? What are the relationships created? Why do they matter? The fact that I'm constantly thinking about this material, but I'm also thinking about it not just in the notion of the maker as the individual who's very humbly bent over their craft and making something, but in the context of the social. What does it do to the collective? How do we think about the collective? What are the terms that we end up using in everyday parlance to talk about the collective, which kind of might indicate what our own desires and our hopes and aspirations are? The fact that we shape and transform each other, this might seem very self-evident, but perhaps this is something that we could do well to preface every book that we write, that we are constantly transforming and interacting with each other. We are constantly changing each other, and that we need to take more seriously the call to theorize this transformation through craft and making. Varnier says, of course, from a child development and psychology perspective, the child is provided with emotional, material, and intellectual resources by scores of people who build up their subjectivity. And it is a permanent process of interaction. It starts with your birth and it goes on through life. Similarly, even the least integrated of us, even those of us who are least socialized or think that we are most independent, are dependent in some way and are experiencing not only drives and for satisfaction, but also these notions of being incomplete and being dependent on others. This notion of incompleteness is something that comes from Francis Nyamjo's work on the idea of incompleteness. And I also look forward to fleshing that more in future work. Ultimately, why does all of this matter? Why does all this theorizing matter? Why does all this heavy lifting matter? Because in the end, we want to live uh, insert your adjective here, a decent, better, good human life together with other people. So that's pretty much where I'd like to stop, and really looking forward to hearing from my wonderful colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you, Amila.
Thanks very much, Shamila. And I really enjoy how you presented your personal story there. It kind of contradicts the more kind of managerial view of academics as being people who shuffle ideas and information, but more the, say, East Asian idea of the scholar as somebody who also cultivates a material taste and pleasure and connection to things. So moving to Brazil now, Patricia, would you like to tell us about your very interesting exploration of material culture in your part of the world?
Of course, that's going to be a pleasure. Just wanted to be sure, how much time do I have?
If you could keep it to about 8 minutes, is that okay?
Yeah. Well, I want to thank Kevin for this wonderful opportunity, and I had so much fun having this ride in Urmila's roller coaster. It was great having the opportunity to write about this spiritual work, I would say. I belong to Umbanda, which is a African-based religion in Brazil. I used to be Catholic, and then 20-something years ago, I moved to Umbanda. And Umbanda is it's an orally transmitted tradition. So we deal a lot with bodily practices and objects. And this sort of twisted my mind, because like going from Catholicism, which has written doctrine, and to such a stimulating, like thinking about bodily practices, such a stimulating religion was very interesting. And at the same time I moved to Umbanda, I also started my scholarly career. So it was interesting that I started both more or less at the same time. So as much as I was becoming a devotee, Umbanda devotee, I was also becoming a religious studies scholar. So as I wrote this paper, and as I write many of my work, much of my work, I'm always stepping to like both roles. I have this two people inside of me, and this makes it interesting, because Umbanda is not possible to know, like to really know it, being an outsider. But at the same time, I have the theories from religious studies which help me to see things in Umbanda which I would never see as well if I didn't have the theories. So I really like this, and I think it's a way of somehow breaking one of these binaries that we have in West. So at the same time, I'm a devotee, but also a scholar, and I use a lot of autoethnography methods. And my chapter is all about this. So I particularly work in this chapter about making dolls for entities, for spiritual entities that manifest through spirit possession in Umbanda. So the spirits, they ask what they want. They ask their objects, they ask for specific clothing and objects they use to, let's say, spiritually work. And so I was asked to make a doll for this particular entity. And I had no idea I could do so. And this was fantastic, because the impression I always get from Umbanda is that by talking to these embodied spirits in mediums, they know us more than we know ourselves, because Umbanda presupposes reincarnation. So such spirits, they know who we were in previous lives, and they know what we are particularly doing in this lifetime. So when this entity asks me to make her a doll like herself, she knew I could do it. I didn't know I could do it, but she knew it. So she asked me a doll like that looked like her, but I had never seen her, because she was manifesting through a particular person, a medium. But of course, they have different bodies, and they used to be the spirit was a different person. So how could I know what she was look like? But I had intuitions and I had dreams, and somehow it came to my mind like a sort of within a period of 2 months, I made the doll. And I would have ideas, very specific ideas on how to make it. And this is something not rational, as Urmila was saying, like not always we know why and what we're exactly doing. So I wasn't sure. I mean, rationally speaking, I didn't know what I was doing, but at the same time, I had a feeling that that was the right thing to do. So I remember the day I went shopping for the fabrics and materials and stuff for making this doll. And I was so precise. I went to this district where they sell fabrics and things like this. And I knew what to get. I would go and say, I want some of this and some of this and some of this. I never shopped so quickly. So I brought everything home, and I had never made a doll ever in my entire life. And she didn't tell me anything about it when she manifested in this medium. She just said, I want a porcelain doll. That's all she told me. So I had a porcelain doll at home from my teenagers, from when I was a teenager. So I got this doll and I said, well, I gotta get this pieces, this porcelain head and feet and hands. And that was such an adventure also to find these pieces. And I did find, and they're all white, like porcelain for dolls are traditionally white. And I know this particularly entity because she had African background. She would have black skin. So I would have to find a way to make her skin black. So I wasn't sure about the paints I needed to use, which ones would work, because I never painted porcelain ever in my life. So I was just playing around and testing. So I bought 7 sets of heads, hands, and feet, because I thought if I make a mistake on the first one, then I have 6 more to try. And but the interesting thing was that I got the first one right. So I painted this doll, and then I was sewing the clothing and all that, and I just knew that that was right. So as I said before, it took me 2 months more or less to make it. I would do a little bit each day, and it was so interesting when Urmila invited me to write about intimacy. Because that's exactly what I felt making this doll. I felt like I was talking to her somehow as I was making the doll. Of course, I don't have any way to prove or to demonstrate or anything. You can only trust in what I say I felt. But it was interesting how I felt really a connection. And then I was being very precise. I made no mistakes as I was making. And once I finished the doll, I just realized that somehow I had this knowledge within myself, and I knew like I could make it, but I didn't know. So this was an opportunity somehow to find something out about myself. She knew I could do it because the day she asked me, she was very precise. She said, "You can make it." I'm like, okay. And then I made it, and then I found out that I actually could make it. Like in my entire life, I was drawing and painting on canvas, but I've never done anything like this. And it was really a spiritual experience. Because like you just go and you know you can do it as you do it. I didn't have, differently from when I paint or when I draw, I didn't have a project on my mind. So I just did it as I just found out I could do it as I did. So I'll just show you quickly how the doll looks. And I think that that is pretty much it, since I don't have that much time. So here is the when I started making the doll. So all the white pieces, and this is interesting because like I'm making a black African doll and skin, and this says so much about Umbanda because there is a lot of racism and prejudice in Brazil against African religions. So it was interesting to transform the white porcelain into black skin. So then I painted her face, and then I made the body with cloths, pieces of cloth. And then I was painting the jewelry. Then I made her clothes. And because I got her right in the first one, I made 6 other dolls after. Here are
Great.
3 of them. But the 3 of them, I also made for spiritual entities. They didn't ask me, but because I realized I could make them, I made them as a gift for them. So the first one is a gypsy doll, and the other 2 are like for an entity which are kind of, they're like childlike spirits, and they also manifest through spirit possession. So I guess this is it. And I thank you for your attention.
Wow, what an incredible story. Obrigado. Thank you so much, Patricia. But let's quickly move on, and we'll have a chance to chat about that afterwards, to Susan and your quite, well, equally fascinating chapter on the textiles, particularly in North Sumatra. I found it so poetic, some of the references you made to their practices. So if you can tell us a bit more about that chapter.
I shall. As Armilla was talking, it occurred to me why I so quickly joined her ambitious project about moving more toward feeling, sensory experience, emotion. Early in my time at Holy Cross, which is a Jesuit institution, a Jesuit liberal arts college, I was doing some collaborative work with an art historian, the late Jody Ziegler, and she invited me to a research talk she was giving about a group of Beguine nuns who were very unusual nuns in the 1100s and 1200s in what now is Belgium. And these nuns had a deep devotion to, I guess, Patricia, what we could call dolls in a way, to figures of the Virgin Mary in a Pietà setting. The grown Christ has just been killed on the cross, and he's been taken down, and as in the Michelangelo sculpture, the Virgin is holding him across her lap. And apparently what these 11th and 12th century and 13th century Beguines would do is they would dress the Virgin every day. They had kind of a whole set of clothing. They would get new clothing, and that was their form of worship. And I found that fascinating as an anthropologist. And then I kind of dropped it because that was Jodi's work. And my whole career has been focused on texts, on written text, on printed text. The Ankola Batak are wonderful writers since the 1860s. They're deeply literate in the Latin alphabet. They're journalists, they're novelists, they're folklorists. And so over the years, I've translated a number of their novels, even some childhood memoirs by related societies, and an epic poem. And so I kind of went off in numerous books and journal articles toward literacy and literate text. And when Urmila asked if there was a material culture aspect to any of my work, I jumped at the chance to come back to it. And I ended up writing this, for me, very educational article. It's based on 2 textiles from the Sapir Oak area. If any of you're in the neighborhood, this is an ulos. It's a hand-woven textile. This is one that is actually for a baby. It's a baby carrier. You stick the little kid inside and you kind of tote him or her around, weighted down by the heaviness of the child, so he doesn't fall on the floor. And early in my work, I had been asked by Maribel Gittinger, the then Southeast Asia curator of the Textile Museum in Washington, D.C., to join a conference way back in 1978 to write about this particular type of textile and its companion textile, the abit godang, which is a large dancing cloak. But it looks the same as this, and it's made by the same weavers. And I said, sure, because I think the reason that Maribel had asked me to write that article is she knew I had tape recorded and studied a number of the orations, the ritual speeches, in which older women would look at this textile as it's presented to a new mom and her baby. And she would speak in, the orator would speak in rhymed couplets. And I had transcripts of those from my tape recordings, and in a very high esoteric form of ritual speech. So I wrote this little article about how the Ankola Batak ritual experts draw meaning from textiles. And then I kind of put that publication off to the side and didn't think any more of it. And then the chance to rethink that article and look at it in terms of how the users of these textiles, Ankola Batak, might have imbued feelings into the textiles and how they materialize, as it were, their sense of kinship, the structure of kinship, and their place in the world was very intriguing to me. So it was a very enlightening article for me. Let me tell you a little bit about these textiles and then what I think is a good direction for textile studies in Indonesia to go in. You probably know, if you've ever been to Indonesia, there's a huge literature on Indonesian textiles. It's probably one of the great places in the world for complex, beautiful textiles, either ikat, that is tie-dyed the threads first, or metal thread songkets. It's just a wonderful place to study textiles. Some of the early work, mostly by art historians, has to do with trade, particularly from India. There is, I'm not going to say this is not good scholarship, it's excellent scholarship. There are a lot of direct influences from Indian textiles into the Indonesian islands. So wonderful shows came from that, like Sari to Sarong, curated by Australia's own Robin Maxwell. So that trade connection is very important in the study of textiles like this. Some art historians even tried to analyze the motifs in some of the textiles. That's kind of hard because the weavers often laugh at you if you ask them what a motif means. They say, well, how should I know if it's somebody else's textile? They only know what their motifs mean. There's a great deal of really wonderful, very rewarding scholarship by cultural anthropologists on textiles and gender. These textiles exemplify that because when a mother has her first baby, the Ankola Batak are still worried about the health of the child and it might not survive its first year. So it needs some extra tua, T-U-A. It needs some extra good luck. And so the young mother's family and that lineage will present one of these textiles to the child and the mother, and that conveys good health, and that conveys kind of magical prosperity. But the gender connection to textiles goes further than this. Janet Hoskins, an anthropologist at University of Southern California, has noted in a wonderful article about Coady textiles that the dye pot, the clay dye pot, which is kind of round and globular, into which the threads of the future textile are dunked into a blue dye, indigo dye, it's a metaphorical representation for Coady people of the pregnant body of the mother. She's kind of soaking the threads of a baby inside her. If she happens to have an accidental miscarriage, older women will try to console her by saying, well, don't worry, dear, you can have another pregnancy soon. The problem with this pregnancy, dear, is just that the threads did not properly soak up the indigo dye. So you've got this connection between personhood ideas and textile hand manufacture. Even a textile, when it's on the loom, on the backstrap loom, is considered a baby growing toward completion. And when it's finished, the mother will take a knife, and she will, the weaver mother, and cut the textile off of the loom. And that knife is the same one that a midwife uses to cut the umbilical cord of a little baby who's just been born. So a lot of good stuff about gender in textiles, politics, ethnic identity in textiles, and so on. But what I wanted to do in this article for Urmila's edited book is to look at how moving in a textile, of course, you can't interview a 4-month-old baby about how it feels to be inside the enwrapping textile, but there's a lot of oratory in the culture, a lot of ritual speech about the whole scene of the mother carrying the baby in a ritual procession. And there's probably even more ritual couplets about rajas, that's traditional chiefdoms, who use the textiles to dance. And these are not just secular dances at all. You have to kill a water buffalo to open the passageway between the here and now and the beneficent dead, and they will give their permission for the rajas, the chiefdoms, to dress in this sort of ritual costume with the textile wrapped around them and dancing in this slow, mesmerizing way. And then some of the Angola families, the wealthier ones, are beginning to borrow an image from the Toba Batak to their north, where if they have a particularly lavish wedding, they'll have the bride sit right beside their new husband, which almost never happens in Batak society. You never see a husband and wife walking down the street together. So this is a ritual scene. And a big ulos blanket textile is wrapped around the pair of them, enveloping them as a social unit. So I go through a number of indications from the oral ritual speech about what the Angola Batak experiencers, wearers of these textiles think. But let me add another thing. This is a deficiency of the article, and it's because you can't do everything in one chapter. But for the last year and a half, I've been doing quite a different project here in Worcester, Massachusetts, with refugee artisans. I've been partnering with a nonprofit called Refugee Artisans of Worcester. Most of the artisans are weavers, or sculptors, or basket makers, workers in bamboo, sometimes in wood. From Bhutan, Nepali-speaking Bhutanese, from Burma, minority societies like the Karen, and then from 3 African societies. And I've interviewed these people we just finished a digital archive of their work. So me and my Holy Cross undergraduate students would interview these people in their home studios. And I want to end with one. She's a basket maker. She's from Rwanda. This should be somebody else's second project. She told us that when she was at home in her original country, she saw some very violent scenes. She saw family members being murdered in front of her by armed militia who were sort of on the rampage. She couldn't really deal with that. So she fled as a forced migrant refugee to a United Nations administered refugee camp in Uganda. And she was having a very hard time in her first months there. She kept having intrusive images, intrusive memories of seeing the violence again, and that would just immobilize her. But one day she was walking down a path in the refugee camp. She looked over to the side. There were some long grasses growing. She plucked some that she had never been trained to weave before. She plucked some up, and she remembered by looking in the window or the door at the camp, the refugee camp craft house, that women who work there for pay were weaving baskets. And so she decided, well, I'm going to try to weave a basket in the same shape as the baskets they're doing. And she immediately discovered that the tactile sense of weaving a basket with an image in her mind of a beautiful basket stopped, it just stopped cold those intrusive thoughts from the trauma in her past. And I pursued that with interviews with other refugee artisans here in Massachusetts. And it's repetitive. They're not just making crafts. And it's not just kind of, physical therapy, art therapy at all. It's much denser with political and personal meaning. So I think that's an aspect, Urmila, of the efficacious intimacy that really needs to be explored by somebody. The ability of craft work, the handiwork part, the textile brain feelings, sensory feelings of making a beautiful craft that connects to today's repetitive, awful traumas going on with all this forced migration around the world. So I've got a lot more to say, but I'll stop at that point.
Well, thank you so much. That was equally fascinating and also lovely to see your personal engagement through that. I loved your chapter, Susan, for the ways in which the textiles were so bound up with the whole business of fertility and looking after children and so on. I'm familiar with that in the batik world as well, but it's interesting to see it in terms of ulos. So normally, if we were in a room together physically, we would applaud, and we probably could do something similar to that. But I think the convention now, which is a very nice one, is to have a screenshot. So if you've got your cameras off and you're not too embarrassed about what you might reveal, you're welcome to turn the camera on while we take a screenshot, so that Miller, Patricia and Susan will also have a record of this event as well. Maybe some people are in their pajamas, which is quite possible given the hour in different parts of the world.
If my cats show up, just ignore them.
Sure. I know that Emma's here, who's contributed to the latest issue of Garland magazine, a wonderful article about some Catholic graffiti, feminist graffiti in Poland, which is good. Okay. Well, we've got a lovely group of people. We've got our colleagues from Moana Oceania here. So if you could, I'll just count down so we can put on our best Zoom face. Okay. 1, 2, 3. Great. Fabulous. Thanks very much. Now, we have time briefly to talk about some of the so many issues and questions that have come up from what we've heard. Would anyone like to begin with an observation or comment, question? Well, perhaps I'll just start to get people going. I'm wondering, in terms of the broader context of this efficacious intimacy, how it relates to consumerism, because obviously our dominant relationship in the contemporary world, particularly capitalist world, is through objects that we purchase, maybe don't necessarily have a strong attachment to. We can have a strong desire for, maybe more temporary, but our world is filled with such objects, and platforms like Amazon are now continually offering us these.
Mhm.
Is there any, do you think there's a fundamental difference between the sort of objects that feature in this volume and the sorts of objects that most people, their cars, their smartphones, the sort of kitchen appliances, the branded jewelry and textiles? Are these capable of having the same efficacious intimacy that, similar to the dolls that you talk about, Patricia, the crochet, the Ulos textiles? Is there something this kind of opens up a political issue about what it is to be in a consumerist society? Do you have any thoughts about that?
Does
I have
anybody want to?
one in terms of what's going on in Indonesia. Anybody who visits Indonesia, particularly Bali, but also the department stores in Jakarta, find that these once sacred textiles and baskets and dye pots and everything are being commodified up the wazoo. I mean, it's just, it's just a very strong push in Indonesian capitalism. And the producers of a textile like these from Sapirok has lost control of that. Often it's even another ethnic group who produces some of these things in factories. For instance, some of the Indonesian Chinese families own factories that turn out traditional objects of different sorts. So it's a very poignant situation for kind of control of intellectual property that's going on.
So it's partly also about the handmade, is it? That
Some of the textiles that you can buy in Bali are actually hand woven. Some of them are manufactured in factories, but some are hand woven, but in kind of a schlocky way. I think the weavers, though, this may apply to other Indonesian indigenous arts, can maintain a level of craftspersonship excellence that the rip-off copies cannot attain. So that helps them to keep control of things. They have standards of dye work, for instance, the preparation of secret recipes for making indigo dye and so on, that keeps some of the objects close at hand, I would say. But I'm not sure how long that's going to last.
There's an element of mystery there, like the medium that Patricia connected with to develop the doll. Miller, did you have something to add?
Yeah, actually, so a number of things are coming to mind as you and Susan were talking. It's interesting how we've also already kind of jumped into the assumption that craft is something that is associated with knowledge and a high level of skill. So I think that even the meta context of the question is also interesting to think about the handmade and the association that there is a kind of expectation or anticipation of skill, and therefore, as Susan was saying, there is a narrative of loss. Also, when we talk about, I know you were talking about commodification and consumerism. There's a lot of course, counter that brings in the whole idea about climate change and people trying to do recycling, and of course, making with plastic and weaving with plastic and working with discarded cloths. So we do have that kind of regeneration of making and hand making with these materials, which has been actually going on for a very long time, not just in the last 3 decades, but much before that, because these so-called Western materials were also finding their way into non-Western contexts. And you only have to think about German dyes to realize that that influence and that interaction has been going along. The question for me is, what can researchers do to deal with this question and really flesh it out? So on one hand, we have material culture studies of consumption. We have the whole school by Daniel Miller and all his acolytes. So we're talking about consumption, this notion of breaking this binary between production and consumption by saying, in the mode of, De Soto saying that your practices of usage are also practices of interpretation, readaptation, adaptation, and creativity. So that's one way of thinking about it. If you follow that line of thinking, being in Bali at Tumpak Landep when they are worshiping those metal, traditional ritual meant for metal artifacts like kris, that is being adapted by a person who owns a camera shop to include sanctification and ritualization of objects like cameras, computers, power cords, right? So I think I really think that the answer is in the research, that this is a perfect opportunity for seeing how people have adapted and have responded to overcome that binary logic and even that dystopian view of the handmaid coming to an end, which also puts us subsequently in the position of having to say we have to conserve, we have to revitalize, we have to renew. So I think there's something to be said about that dynamic that we have to look at much more closely. And the reality is that people are doing stuff out there that actually is much more creative and actually not being recognized, right? So there's also this notion of interaction with machines. We think of it as a binary. You're either working with something that is a machine, or I'm working with a crochet needle. Okay, these are both tools. We agree with that. But there are also levels of mechanization. We only have to look at somebody like the Amish who've been fighting that struggle for, ever since the 1700s. If we want to talk to somebody about commodification and interaction with machines, we have to go back to those kind of forms of research. We have to kind of think outside the box, outside of this discourse of making, to actually think about the values. But is there an easy answer? No. But when you were talking about this, I realized that there was so much out there.
Among the refugee artisans here in Massachusetts, many of them, even the quite elderly ones, are absolutely taking control of the whole commodification business and making more and more sellable, but still very beautiful weavings and so on, and claiming those as their own. And when I interview them, they're not talking about, oh, this is authentic or this is traditional or something. This is something that I made. And RAW, the Refugee Artisans of Worcester nonprofit, is marketing it. And they seem to be happy that Americans are purchasing it and putting it in their homes. The poignant part is something that happened, I saw with a sculptor. He makes what in their original form were religiously infused sculptures from Bhutan. And he's a refugee here in town. He's lived here for a number of years. He's on the way toward American citizenship. He makes these sculptures, and then he says when they are put on for sale through this nonprofit, he worries, he's very anxious because the sculptures have a spiritual presence, and he doesn't want the purchasing family to just plunk it down in your backyard as a garden decoration, because the sculpture should have a base, a frame to sit upon so it doesn't touch the backyard soil. But from interviews, it's clear he knows he's lost control of that part. He can't tell somebody on Salisbury Street who's purchased his marble sculpture of a Nepali / Bhutanese god what to do with it. So again, for some people, it's a partial loss of control. For other people, the weavers, they have more control. And they find the capitalist scene for craft work, which is quite popular here in Massachusetts, kind of exuberant and fun to play with, and they get some money. But there go the sacred marble sculptures into a domain which is not spiritual, which is totally aesthetic. So it's really a mixed bag.
Well, it certainly behooves us to try and keep those stories behind those objects alive so that people are aware of that through whatever means we can. Susan, I wonder, Patricia, it'd be nice to hear from you before we go. And I thought one interesting aspect, you might have something else to contribute, but most of the examples we've spoken about seem to, in terms of gender, relate to women. and whether intimacy is something which is a particularly gendered kind of modality. And in the case of Umbanda, whether what you're working with relates, I think, mostly to female divinities and so on. Is there an equivalent male engagement that you found that is different, or is this whole business more feminine?
I'm just talking about something from about the previous question.
Oh,
I just
sure.
wanted to say that although I think it's possible to develop like efficacious intimacy with something that you buy, like with ready-made things. But I think because we can buy stuff, we've been making less and less. And I think there is a loss in terms of cognition, because as we move our hands or our bodies in certain ways, we develop our minds as well. So I guess we're making less and less, and some people will not know what they're capable of. And I think this would have happened to me if it wasn't for this case in Umbanda. So somehow I think these oral-based religions, very traditional, they may be a place that preserves this kind of knowledge. So this is one thing. And answering your question about gender, in Umbanda, there is also things that men can do. So I think there is opportunity for both. There are activities for men, and there's also activities for women. This is very specific, but I believe Umbanda has more space for women because of the African mythology, because there is a lot of goddesses. So I believe Umbanda is a very fertile space for equality of gender. So we have in Brazil, we have a lot of priestesses and temples that are run by women. And I do credit this to African mythology.
I see. Terrific. There's so much more to say, and I think this is just a taste of the journey that you're all on that I think shares a lot with the sorts of issues that we've been discussing. I wanted, before we go, particularly to introduce our colleagues, Kolakesa and Barbara, maybe just to say something a little about what you've been doing too, because I think there are parallels, like with the Talk Story series, where you've looked at different Moana cultures in order to understand, particularly their material culture, what's unique and the role that plays. I think I've got your book, Kolakesa, Crafting Aotearoa, here, just as an example of some of the amazing scholarship that has been behind the sort of work that you and Barbara are doing. But can you tell us what you're up to at the moment?
Oh, thank you, Kevin, and firstly, thank you, Urmila, Susan, and Patricia for the insights into the work that you're doing, which is amazing because we're just sitting here listening and finding parallels with the work that we're doing here. So I'm of Tongan heritage. Barbara, my colleague over there, is Samoan, and we are two of the biggest diaspora communities living here in Aotearoa, which is the indigenous lands of Māori. But we work with any community that approach us. I think we were founded as an organization by working with our Cambodian community. We didn't mean to set up what we're doing. So we've got a cultural and educational organization called Langimama Academy and Consultancy. But most of our work have been working with our Waira Moana Shane community. So just finding, I think just some thoughts, and I think maybe just touching on our most latest project, which is a massive, bigger book than than what we've and it's on its way to Kevin. So hopefully you got it, Kevin. But this is like a 500-page book, and you might see these are some of the members. So there are Niuean group called Whalepipi He Mafola Niuean Handcraft Group. And this massive 500-page book was focusing on their making practices, but also as diaspora, just sort of reflecting on some of the things that you have all shared is what are these communities, our communities, doing here in Aotearoa to maintain and retain our cultural heritage, but also at the same time innovate, like talking about materials, where you've moved from using the natural materials that you can find back at home to what are the materials that we can use here in Aotearoa, adapting and adopting and using their natural materials, but also opting for more synthetic materials. But the amazing thing with this book, I think, because we work mainly in the cultural sector, and it's interesting, like the project that Kevin has been supportive of, and we're still continuing, is looking at what art is from the 17 plus ethnic island nations that have diaspora communities here in Aotearoa. And it's interesting that within our cultural institutions here and art institutions, religion is not factored into religion and churches and different faith-based sort of beliefs. They see it as separate from art and making art, which does our head in. But for this particular group, as you go through their contributions and their stories, faith is a huge part of their making, and I think just in aligning it with what you're doing, Urmila and Patricia and Susan, in terms of the things that you've shared. But yeah, just it's been amazing, and I think this group is there are 60 plus group. There's many collectives, and these guys were set up mainly as a fellowship for the elderly group. So that's been one of our challenges. It took us 2 years to work on this book, to put it together, to celebrate their 30th anniversary. And in the process of their 30 years, 56 members have passed. 3 master weavers that was acknowledged in the exhibition. 1 master weaver passed away 3 days after we opened last year on April 1st. And 1 just recently passed just over the weekend. So I think just showing how important it is for resources like this. And I think just with going back to what you were saying, Patricia, we are, as Moana Oceania, oral-based cultures, and publishing in a publication like this is very foreign to them. But I think the value of this is that now they've got a record, a tangible record that their families can hold on to, especially those that have members that have passed away. But it is another medium to retain and maintain their culture and heritage, which is something that we push as Langi Mama. So B, I wonder if do you want to add anything? Oh yeah, so I think that's it, Kevin. I hope that has given an insight. That's all we can share, but just to thank each and every one of you, Urmila and Patricia and Susan, just in the work that you're doing, with our communities, because I think collectively that's one of the amazing things we've really enjoyed and being part of, connected with Kevin, but also with the Knowledge House for Craft, is appreciating the diversity of our global village and what each and everyone is doing to contribute to that. So thank you, Kevin.
Thanks very much, Kesa. Urmila, did you have something to add?
Yes, actually, I think this is an excellent ethnographic moment also with me, that I wanted to both respond to what Kolakesa was saying and also emphasize this for Patricia and Susan. Sometimes we wonder if it makes any difference that we publish what we publish and that we write, that we use the medium of writing. And I won't say we, but I encounter some people who are sometimes very overzealous in their criticism of people who just write about making. And I think that what Kolakesa has shown us is exactly why it matters. It matters to document, it matters to record, it matters to write, because I don't know about the community that you're working with, Kolakesa, but in the case of encountering, weavers in smaller villages in India, if I would meet them and they would show me a book where an article about them had been written, for example, and we're not just talking about newspaper clippings, it would be a book that was, a collation of different artisans, and they would be included in that. And they would show that to me immediately. I would like to caution any of my colleagues who would kind of poo-poo something like that and say, no, that matters. It matters to that person because these are forms of social and cultural capital. It's very
Yeah.
easy to be critical when we already possess those tools and we already participate in those kind of networks of circulation and literacy and print capitalism or whatever you want to call it. But doing craft research or supporting craftsmen is not only about the monetary part of it. It's also this other part. And I think the example that you illustrated was superb because this was about community and it made the case not just for this particular community and group of people, but for the value of that publication also. So thank you.
Well, that's a very, very good note to end the formal part of our gathering in the Knowledge House. Thank you for being our guests, and hopefully you'll be our friends and continue to be involved. We're challenged by time zone, obviously, but we'll find opportunities like this to bridge that difference. And I'm sure we'll have a lot more to discuss. There are many parallels that I think we can follow up on this. Thank you so much, Urmila, Susan, and Patricia, and Kolakesa and Barbara as well.